Start with a big question. Yeah. Yeah. I think, I mean, from my point of view, I'll answer. Can I answer the question two ways? I think what's important to me as an educator, and I think then what might be important to you as a student. What's important to me as an educator is that I fully understand the kind of period of time you're going to live in as an architect. So I guess you were born in 1997, 98? Yeah?
I'm a little bit older.
You're a little bit older. But, you know, thereabouts, the mid to late 1990s, most first-year students in the world were born around about then. And that, to me, is, you know, quite, in a sense, eye-opening as a thought. You know, that I was teaching for the first time in 1995, but to think that, you know, many of the first-year students in universities today weren't born when I was really just beginning to understand where I used to fit in, you know, where I began to fit into the subject of architecture, and I'm still working it out. And a lot of the ways in which I've come to this position were informed by tutors who were born in the 1970s, you know. So the first thing is that it's about time, and I think the important thing for me to be aware as an educator is that we're keeping the subject alive. Okay, that's the first thing. So, because it's a practice. Ultimately, architecture is it's a practice-based subject. You know, it has huge amounts of resources in the world of theory, in the world of understanding and research, but the vast bulk of it is around the shaping of the world we live in, and so on. And it's very easy to kind of get stuck on one view in the middle of such a huge subject as that. And the thing that is very important as an educator is to think, well, what's going to hit you when you're at the peak of your career as a generation? So you'll be hitting the peak of your career in 2030, you know, around about then, 2035. And we have to think as educators, what are going to be the most important things for you then? Which I can tell you are radically different to what they were for me when I was your age. So when I was your age, what an architect was meant to do was relatively similar of what an architect did 50 years before, or even, frankly, nearly 100 years before. But today, what an architect might do in the future is radically different. The options ahead of you are vast compared to the options we understood at the time. And the challenges facing you are also much more evident to you. So, you know, the obvious ones are about environments and about cities. You know, 50% of the world population lives in cities. You know, the way in which environmental conditions are now very vulnerable to the ways in which we use industries and so forth. So these are the big issues facing your future. When we were students, I think we were a little bit lost in, say, thinking about the future of the role of the heroic architect, you know, and the future of the subject of architecture. Whereas I think the future for you is thinking how your knowledge fits into the world and how you can use that knowledge to change things. And you might fit in so many different places in the future. You could fit into the world of the very beginning, the very early stages of identifying ideas and challenges and developing positions one might take to go forward from those. Or you might decide to position yourself right at the very end, which is the delivery of artifacts like buildings. And there's a huge range of stuff in between. The other thing that's different for your future compared to mine is that you're working amongst a much bigger team. So back in the 80s and 90s, it was relatively simple team. There was contractors, there were engineers, quantity surveyors, architects, accountants, and so on. Relatively, you know, a relatively small team of disciplines delivering things that we all did. Whereas now you're in the world of collaborating with industry, collaborating with different types of client organizations, individuals, different types of technology and how to make things, represent things. You might collaborate with the film industry. You might collaborate with manufacturing. So how to see how you fit in, I think, is the thing that I have to think about. So the most important thing in terms of a school is keeping the subject alive and making it relevant to your future. My future is already here. You know what I mean? You know, I'm living now in the sort of the future that was set up for me when I was a student, whereas we now have to think about the future you'd be living in. And then to answer it maybe from your point of view, maybe following on from that is to have a vision, you know, about the future, and to realize that the education you're going through is only the first step that you're going to be taking. But I think what's absolutely important is to understand how that environment, the university environment, can be examined now much more deeply than perhaps we did before. We took it a little bit for granted before, that you were in your silo. You know, your architects were in that building, engineers were in that building. Whereas a university now, to me, is an immensely exciting machine in society, that it's breaking down its boundaries. And some of the things I'll talk about in the lecture will demonstrate how universities are becoming laboratories of making things and manufacturing things, taking risk out of the economy, and doing things that businesses can't afford to get wrong, but things that go wrong for us are positive. And understanding that whilst you're a student, even in the time that you're a student, your future is changing. You know, so I think the most important thing to say to students is make the full use of your opportunities. Yeah. I think first thing, it sounds like in your question you're recognizing that schools are different, which is a very positive thing to recognize when you're a student. They are all different. They all should be different, and they're shaped, I think, predominantly by the people that are in them. So the individuals that are in them, from the technicians that work in the workshop to the people who work in the cafeteria to the professors and so on, they make sort of an organism that you respond to, and that shapes the school. As well as that, a school has to have a vision, and the vision has to be very clear, I think, to students in terms of what are the priorities. So because architecture is such a huge subject, you could very easily try to ask your students to do too much. You could just keep going sideways, like a pool of mercury on a table. And I think a school needs to understand that it's a very big subject, but what it needs to also do is set out its stall in what it wants to be the best at, and what it wants to be really good at. So the school that Stephen was at, and the school that I work at, and I was a student there as well, we've said very, very clearly, about 30 years ago, design is absolutely the number one thing we want to be the best at. And now that sounds like stating the obvious, but it's actually quite hard to achieve a curriculum that emphasizes design as much as we do. You're constantly being told by people who adjudicate or accredit architecture programs of this, you have to do everything as well as design. And our tactic in getting around that was to say that it's the project that absorbs all these questions. So the project is a design project, but it absorbs questions of history and theory, it absorbs questions of technology, it absorbs questions of culture. And the student then starts to understand that as an architect, what you're looking at on a screen or in a workshop on a bench, which is your work, is the place where you're resolving those questions. It's not somewhere else that you go off and you write a paper, or give a lecture. It's through the work that you resolve that. So schools, not all schools will do that the same way. So some schools will be attached to, say, for example, a very technical university, and therefore they'll have great connections with engineering and so on. So they will use that to their advantage and emphasize that. Other schools might be in an arts kind of environment, and they will develop that relationship very, very clearly. For us, actually, we're in predominantly a medical university, which in some senses is no help at all, because the medical faculties are very big and powerful and cost a lot of money to run, that they're focused at the health service, the National Health Service, and resolving the dilemmas of chronic illnesses and so on. But because we're an old university, well, not old compared to Cambridge and Oxford, but we're 200 years old, architecture was there at the very early stages as this critique of how cities and buildings were shaped. So we have our own history, which goes back to the beginning of the school. So some schools are old, some schools are young and new, and they're all going to be different. So a bit like the students. And I think it would be very easy to, I suppose, miss the chance to give a school a profile. But I think a school has to have one, and I think they all have to be different. That's a really good question, and I'm going to talk about that in the lecture. Actually, a huge influence. I think it's the main reason I am in academia. Actually, I never had any intentions of being an academic at all. I chose architecture because I wanted to work in practice. I wanted to, be in a studio where with people working with engineers and building buildings and so on, and I thought that was my future. But I came to it quite late. I was in my mid-20s when I started university, and I'd already done a bit of that. I'd done about 4 years or so of that. And it is because maybe I was a little bit older than, most typical first-year students. It was the impact of the academic environment that hit me most. It was the way in which it becomes a cauldron of questions and ideas. And I became a bit addicted, actually, and I haven't been able to shake it off. So I've tried to escape university several times. I set up my own practice with my best friend, Nick, who Stephen knows very well. Nick now runs a factory in Blankenburg here in Germany, a very successful steel fabrication firm. And you won't know me or Nick, but people who do know us find it very funny that he was the one who went into industry and I was the one who ended up in academia, because he's a really natural academic. So he wrote a book before I did, and then he left and went to work in industry, and I found myself still in academia. And one of the main reasons is I think it's the pressure students put upon us to be kind of challenged all the time, and to come back with a good answer that makes me want to stay in that world. So students have a huge influence, and one of the projects I'm going to talk about in the lecture actually is where those boundaries between my work and students' work overlapped. Now this is a taboo subject in academia. It's in some institutions it's regarded to be something you cannot possibly do or even talk about. The students' work has to be completely removed from the academics' work. But when you're in a subject which is about exploring ideas, who's to say where the idea started? The idea is in the ether, and I think what actually matters most of all in architecture is how an idea moves from one place to another. So amongst a group of students who on one level don't have the experience of industry or of academia, that question will get a certain response, maybe a fantastic response. And then it's because of that response and it moves into academia, the response from academia might be different. So my view is, as long as you make it very clear what contribution you made to the work, so if the academic is making it very clear what contribution they made to the work and what contribution their students made to the work, we're here to work together, students and academics. And I think perhaps more than any other subject, architecture is best suited to explore that. In other subjects in universities, it's not that easy to explore that. The worlds are kept relatively far apart. When I was a student, we didn't know what the research was of our tutors and our professors unless we went looking for it. Whereas now it's very explicit that the type of work I will do in the school will be the type of work I want my students to do with me. So that's the studio-based structure of our school, which comes from the AA in Bedford Square, is that the studio is based around the explicit interests of the tutor, which in my instance are designing and making things. And I make it very clear that's what I'm doing and that's what I'm interested in doing, but it changes because of what the students do. So I've been teaching now nearly 20 years. To some extent, I'm very different now as a tutor than I was back then. And and it's because of that progression that difference has been made. You know? So I mean, I cannot understate the influence students have on academia. It's to me the entire purpose of a university, that it's populated by students. Otherwise, why have it?